Not until then does he go to himself. Last of all, as the one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached, so you believed. Connecting this argument to the argument from authority. What evidence? Scriptural evidence. The Bible foretold these things that would occur. What evidence? Eyewitness evidence. That there are individuals who saw this resurrected Christ after his resurrection. What evidence? Personal evidence. That I saw this resurrected Christ after his resurrection. Note that Paul does not take his own isolated experience and argue solely from that isolated experience. That's not the power of the gospel. The power of the gospel is not that I've been changed. What's the difference between you and the 1,000 other people who've been changed by 1,000 other things? What's the difference between you and the man who's been in AA for 15 years and hasn't taken another drink? It changed him. What's the difference between you and the Muslim? Or you and the moral Hindu, or the moral Buddhist, or the moral Mormon? What's the difference? There is no difference if all we have is our own personal story. But that's not Paul's line of argumentation. Paul says this is true. First piece of evidence, the scriptures that were fulfilled. Second piece of evidence, the eyewitnesses who saw this. Third piece of evidence, my own testimony. Now, be careful here. Here's what Paul is not doing. Paul is not giving us a pattern whereby we argue first from those evidences and then from our own testimony. His testimony is a little bit different than your testimony. But even so, watch this. In Galatians chapter 2, at the end of Galatians chapter 1, Paul goes back to the other apostles after 3 years of being instructed by the Lord and confirms his gospel. Watch this. One of the most fascinating and most overlooked pieces of the New Testament. Galatians chapter 2, just to the right a little bit. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, the apostles, or privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaimed among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. Same phrase. Unless you believed in vain. He says, I want to make sure that I hadn't run in vain. But wait a minute, Paul. You've seen all this fruit from your ministry among the Gentiles for 12 years. How could you possibly have run in vain? You've got all this fruit in front of you. If what I was preaching did not line up with what they were preaching, then my fruit would have been in vain. He does not point to himself as the authority, but to the gospel as the authority. He points to himself as one in the apostolic line. He is defending his apostleship here. Paul is not saying that you have to somehow muster up your own personal experience that will be as powerful as my personal experience, because that's what's going to tip the scales. No, what Paul says is this. Number one, there's the argument from authority, and the authority is I preach this gospel to you. You listen to this gospel. You're saved by this gospel. That's where you stand. Unless you moved away from this gospel that I preached to you. Then there's the evidence. What's the evidence? The scriptures that have been fulfilled. The eyewitnesses who saw. And I myself who have apostolic authority because God placed me in this line of eyewitnesses. This goes back to the authority of the New Testament, people. It's not about me and my experience. This is about the authority of the New Testament. Here's the problem. If we look at this and all we see is that Paul is saying you tip the scales with your own personal experience, then our job becomes this. I have to have a compelling enough story to tip the scales so that men will be saved. Now, it's not the gospel that's the power of God unto salvation. It's my story. That's why people start lying. Amen. If you can't say amen, you ought to say ouch. You ought to hear some testimonies and how they develop over time.